The siege of the international legations occurred during the Boxer Rebellion in the Chinese city of Beijing. Menaced by the Boxers, an anti-Christian, anti-foreign peasant movement, 900 soldiers, marines and civilians, largely from Europe, Japan, and the United States, and about 2,800 Chinese Christians took refuge in the Beijing legation quarter. The Qing government took the side of the Boxers. The foreigners and Chinese Christians in the legation quarter survived a 55-day siege by the Qing army and the Boxers. The siege was broken by an international military force which marched from the coast of China, defeated the Qing army, and occupied Beijing. The siege was called by the New York Sun, the most exciting episode ever known to civilization, Legation Quarter. The Legation Quarter was approximately 2 miles long and 1 mile wide. It was located in the area of the city designated by the Qing government for foreign legations. In 1900, there were 11 legations located in the quarter as well as a number of foreign businesses and banks. Ethnic Chinese-occupied houses and businesses were also scattered about the quarter. The 12 or so Christian missionary organizations in Beijing were not located in the legation quarter, but rather dispersed around the city. In total, there were about 500 citizens of Western countries and Japan residing in the city. The northern end of the legation quarter was near the imperial city where the Empress Dowager Cixi resided. The southern end was bounded by the massive Tartar Wall which ringed the entire city of Beijing. The eastern and western ends were major streets. Rising tensions. By 1900 the great powers had been chipping away at Chinese sovereignty for 60 years. They had forced China to allow the import of opium, which caused widespread addiction, defeated China in several wars, asserted a right to promote Christianity, and imposed unequal treaties under which foreigners and foreign companies in China were accorded special privileges and immunities from Chinese law. Thus the Qing or Manchu dynasty that had ruled China for more than 2 centuries was crumbling, and Chinese culture was under religious and secular assault by a powerful alien culture. Boxer movement authorities differ as to the origin of the Boxers, but they became prominent in Shandong in 1898 and spread northward toward Beijing. They were an indigenous peasant movement, related to the secret societies that had flourished in China for centuries, and which, on occasion, had threatened Chinese central governments. The Boxers were named, probably by American missionary Arthur H. Smith, for their acrobatic rituals which included martial arts, twirling swords, prayers and incantations. Similar to other anti-Western millenarian movements around the world, such as the ghost dance in the US, the Boxers believed that with the proper ritual they would become invulnerable to Western bullets. The religious and magical practices of the Boxers had as a paramount goal the affording of protection and emotional security in the face of a future that was fraught with danger and risk. The Boxers had no central organization but appear to have been organized on the village level. They were anti-foreign and anti-missionary. Their slogan was, "Support the King, destroy the foreigner." Initially feared as a possible threat by the Chinese government, they slowly gained the support of influential politicians in Beijing, who saw the Boxers as a movement that could be used to eliminate foreign influence in China. Boxers attacked Christians in the spring of 1900. The Boxer movement spread rapidly north from Shandong into the countryside near Beijing. Boxers burned Christian churches, killed Chinese Christians and intimidated Chinese officials who stood in their way. 2 missionaries, Protestant William Scott Ament and Catholic Bishop Favier, reported to the diplomatic ministers about the growing threat. American Minister Edwin H. Conger cabled Washington, "The whole country is swarming with hungry, discontented, hopeless idlers, requesting a warship to be stationed offshore of Tianjin, the nearest port to Beijing," he reported. Situation becoming serious. On May 30, 1900, the diplomats, led by British Minister Claude Maxwell MacDonald, requested that foreign soldiers come to Beijing to defend the legations and the citizens of their countries. The Chinese government reluctantly acquiesced, and the next day more than 400 soldiers from 8 countries disembarked from warships and traveled by train to Beijing from Tianjin. They set up defensive perimeters around their respective missions. On June 5, the railroad line to Tianjin was cut by Boxers in the countryside and Beijing was isolated. On June 13, the Japanese diplomat, Sugiyama Akira, was murdered by soldiers of Gen. Dongfuzhang, and that same day the first Boxer, dressed in his finery, was seen in the legation quarter. The German minister, Clemens von Kettler, and German soldiers captured a Boxer boy and inexplicably executed him. In response, that afternoon thousands of Boxers burst into the walled city of Beijing and burned most of the Christian churches and cathedrals in the city, killing many Chinese Christians and several Catholic priests. The Chinese Christians were accused of collaborating with the foreigners. American and British missionaries and the converts had taken refuge in the Methodist mission, and an attack there was repulsed by American Marines. Soldiers at the British Embassy and German legations shot and killed several Boxers. Dilemma of the Chinese government. In mid-June 1900, the Chinese government was still indecisive about the Boxers. Some officials, Ronglu, for example, counseled the Empress Dowager that the Boxers were rabble who would be easily defeated by foreign soldiers. On the other side of the question were anti-foreign officials who advised cooperation with the Boxers. The court appears to be in a dilemma, said Sir Robert Hart. If the Boxers are not suppressed, the legations threaten to take action. If the attempt to suppress them is made, this intensely patriotic organization will be converted into an anti-dynastic movement, the event that irrevocably pushed the Chinese government to the side of the Boxers was the attack by foreign warships on the Dag forts on June 17. The attack was made to try to maintain communications with Tianjin and aid an army under the command of ADM Seymour in its attempt to march to Beijing and reinforce the legations. On June 19, the Empress Dowager sent a diplomatic note to each of the legations in Beijing informing them of the attack on Dag and ordering all foreigners to depart Beijing for Tianjin within 24 hours. Otherwise, said the note, China will find it a difficult matter to give complete protection. Upon receipt of the note, the diplomats convened and agreed it would be suicidal to leave the legation quarter and travel to the coast in an unfriendly countryside. The next morning, June 20, Baron von Kettler, the German minister, proposed to take up the matter with the Zhongli Yamen, the Chinese Foreign Ministry, but he was murdered by a Manchu officer, Captain N. Hai of the Hushainiang, while en route to the meeting. With this, the ministers informed all the citizens in Beijing to take refuge in the legation quarter. Thus began the 55-day siege. Besieged, the British, American, French, German, Japanese, and Russian military guards each took responsibility for the defense of their respective legations. The Austrians and Italians abandoned their isolated legations. The Austrians joined the French and the Italians collaborated with the Japanese. The Japanese and Italian force established defense lines in the Fu, a large palace and park where most of the estimated 2,800 Chinese Christians taking refuge were housed. The American and German Marines held positions on the Tartar Wall behind their legations. The 409 guards had the job of defending a line that snaked through 2,176 yards of urban terrain. The great majority of the civilians took refuge in the British Embassy, the largest and most defensible of the diplomatic legations. A census of civilians counted 473 people, 245 men, 149 women, and 79 children. About 150 of the men volunteered to participate, to a greater or lesser extent, in the defense. The civilians included at least 19 nationalities, of which British and Americans were the most numerous. Large numbers of Chinese Christians were conscripted for labor, especially for building barricades. The British minister Claude MacDonald was selected as the commander of the defence, and Herbert G. Squires, an American diplomat, became his chief of staff. The guards of the different countries, however, operated semi-independently, and MacDonald could only suggest, not order, coordinated action. The guards were not well armed. Only the American Marines had sufficient ammunition. The defenders had 3 machine guns. The Italians had a small cannon. Fortunately, an old cannon barrel and ammunition was found in the legation quarter, and from it a serviceable artillery piece was constructed that the Americans called Betsy, and others called the International. The foreigners ransacked the legation quarter for food and other supplies. Food and water were adequate, although the foreigners without private food stocks subsisted on a steady diet of horsemeat and musty rice. However, the Chinese Christians, especially the Catholics, had a much harder time of it, and by the end of the siege were starving. The Protestant missionaries took care of their converts, but the Chinese Catholics were mostly neglected. Medical supplies were scarce, but a sizable number of doctors and nurses, mostly missionaries, were present. American missionaries took over management of most necessities for life in the legation quarter, including food, water, sanitation, and health. MacDonald's most important appointment was Methodist missionary Frank Gamewell as chief of the Fortifications Committee. Gamewell and his crew of fighting parsons were universally acclaimed for their defensive work surrounding the British legation. About 3 miles distant from the legation quarter, a similar siege took place at the Baitang or North Cathedral of the Roman Catholic Church. 33 priests and nuns, 43 French and Italian soldiers, and more than 3,000 Chinese Christians held off the Chinese army and Boxers. There was no communication during the siege between the Baitang and the legation quarter. Chinese attacks and resolve. For several days after June 20, the official beginning of the siege, neither the foreigners inside the legation quarter nor the Chinese soldiers outside it had any coherent plan for defense or attack. The number of Chinese soldiers ringing the legations is uncertain, but certainly numbered in the thousands. On the west were the Gansu Muslim soldiers of Dongfujiang, and on the east were units of the Peking Field Army. The overall commander of the Chinese forces was Ronglu, who was anti-Boxer and disapproved of the siege. Chinese policy equivocated between belligerence and conciliation during the 55-day siege. Several attempts by Ronglu to effect a ceasefire failed because of suspicions and misunderstandings on both sides. The Chinese first attempted to extinguish the foreigners in the legation quarter by fire. For several days at the beginning of the siege they set fires in the buildings around the British legation. On June 23, most of the buildings of the Hanlin Academy, the National Library of China, and its books, many irreplaceable, burned. Both sides blamed the other for its destruction. The Chinese army then turned its attention to the Fu, the refuge for most of the Chinese Christians, and the domain of Lt. Col. Goro Shiba, the most admired military officer in the siege. Shiba, with his small group of Japanese soldiers, mounted a skillful defense against the Chinese, who advanced behind walls built ever closer to the Japanese, gradually threatening to surround them in a vice-like grip. British soldiers were often detailed to reinforce the Japanese during attacks and all admired Shiba's work. The most desperate fighting took place near the French legation, where 78 French and Austrians and 17 volunteers were under assault in convoluted urban terrain, in which the front lines were only 50 feet from each other. The French also feared that Chinese sappers were digging tunnels for mines beneath their positions. The Germans and the Americans occupied perhaps the most crucial of all defensive positions, the Tartar Wall. Holding the top of the 45 feet tall and 40 feet wide wall was vital. If it fell to the Chinese, they would have an unobstructed field of fire into the legation quarter. The German barricades faced east on top of the wall, and 400 yards west were the west-facing American positions. The Chinese advanced toward both positions by building barricades ever closer. It was a claustrophobic existence for the soldiers on the wall. "The men all feel they are in a trap," said the American commander, Captain John T. Myers, "and simply await the hour of execution." Added to the daily advances of the Chinese were the nightly serenades of rifle and artillery fire and firecrackers designed to keep the foreigners awake and alert. "From June 20 to July 17 we had nightly attacks," said a missionary woman. American Minister Conger said that some of them, for furious firing, exceeded anything he experienced in the American Civil War. The hard-pressed legation guards saw their numbers diminish daily with casualties. The Chinese were divided on the prosecution of the siege. The anti-Boxer faction, headed by Rong Lu, and the anti-foreign faction, headed by Prince Tuan, squabbled at the Chinese court. Cixi, the Dowager Empress, vacillated between the two. She declared a truce for negotiations on June 25, but it endured only a few hours. She declared a ceasefire on July 17, which lasted for most of the remainder of the siege. As a sign of goodwill, she sent food and supplies to the foreigners. The disagreements among the Chinese occasionally resulted in altercations and violence between Boxers and soldiers and between different units of the Imperial Army. Fight on the wall. The most critical threat to the survival of the foreigners came in early July. On June 30, the Chinese forced the Germans off the Tartar Wall, leaving the American Marines alone in its defense. At the same time, a Chinese barricade advanced to within a few feet of the American positions, and it became clear that the Americans had to abandon the wall or force the Chinese to retreat. At 2 a.m. on July 3, the foreigners launched an assault against the Chinese barricade on the wall with 26 British, 15 Russian and 15 Americans under the command of American Captain John T. Myers. As hoped, the attack caught the Chinese sleeping. About 20 of them were killed and the survivors expelled from the barricades. 2 American Marines were killed and Captain Myers was wounded and spent the rest of the siege in the hospital. The capture of Chinese positions on the wall was hailed as the pivot of our destiny by one of the besieged. The Chinese did not attempt to regain or advance their positions on the Tartar Wall for the remainder of the siege. Darkest days in a truce. Sir Claude MacDonald said July 13 was the most harassing day of the siege. The Japanese and Italians in the Fu were driven back to their last defense line. While the Fu was under heavy attack, the Chinese detonated a mine beneath the French legation, destroying most of it, killing 2 soldiers and pushing the French and Austrians out of most of the French legation. Frank Gamewell began digging bomb-proof shelters as a last refuge for the besieged. The end seemed near. The next day, however, a conciliatory message was received from the Chinese, which raised hopes. Dashed again on July 16 when the most capable British officer was killed and journalist George Ernest Morrison was wounded. However, American Minister Conger carried on a communication with the Chinese government, and on July 17 firing died down on both sides and an armistice began. It was just in time. More than 1/3 of the legation guards were dead or wounded. The motivation on the Chinese side was probably the realization that an Allied force of 20,000 men had landed in China in retribution for the Boxers, and the siege was at hand. Relief of the legations. On July 28, the foreigners in the legation quarter received their first message from the outside world in more than a month. A Chinese boy, a student of the missionary William Scott Ament, sneaked into the legation quarter with the news that a rescue army of the Eight-Nation Alliance was in Tianjin 100 miles away and would advance shortly to Beijing. The news was hardly reassuring, as the besieged had been expecting an earlier rescue. The Chinese government also passed along inquiries about the welfare of the besieged from their governments. A British soldier suggested that an appropriate reply would be, "Not massacred yet." After many relatively quiet days, the night of August 13, with the rescue army just 5 miles outside the gates of Beijing, may have been the most difficult of the siege. The Chinese broke the truce with an artillery barrage of the British legation and heavy fire in the Fu. However, the Chinese confined themselves to firing from a distance rather than mounting an assault until, at 2 a.m. on August 14, the defenders heard from the east the sound of a machine gun, a sign that the rescue army was on the way. At 5 a.m. came the sound of artillery outside the walls of Beijing. 5 national contingents advanced on the walls of Beijing on August 14. British, American, Japanese, Russian and French. Each had a gate in the wall for its objective. The Japanese and Russians were delayed at their gates by Chinese resistance. The small French contingent got lost. The Americans scaled the walls rather than attempting to force their way through a fortified gate. However, it was the British who won the race to relieve the siege of the legations. They entered the city through an unguarded gate and proceeded with virtually no opposition. At 3 p.m. the British passed through a drainage ditch, the Water Gate, under the Tartar Wall. Sikh and Rajput soldiers from India and their British officers had the honour of being the first to enter the legation quarter. The Chinese armies ringing the legation quarter melted away. A short time later the British commander, Gen. Alfred Gately, entered and was greeted by Sir Claude MacDonald dressed in immaculate tennis flannels, and a crowd of cheering ladies in party dresses. The American troops, under Gen. Adna Chaffee, arrived at 5 p.m. The commanding Muslim general, Marfalu, and 4 cousins of his were killed in action against the foreign forces. After the battle was over, the Chinese Muslim forces guarded the Empress Dowager Cixi when she fled to Xi'an with the entire imperial court. The Muslim Gen. Ma Fuzhang assisted in guarding Cixi.